So yesterday, as we were winding up, there were these two questions, that I told you to reflect on, right? So today, before we can move on, we shall reflect, or we shall try to answer these two questions, and then we shall move on. Firstly, we see that Siddhartha, despite being raised in luxury, chose to renounce his princely life to seek enlightenment. So what does this tell us about the Buddhist view on material wealth and spiritual fulfillment? So first let me get your answers, and then I shall try to answer the question. So we say escape from suffering. Should we say escape from suffering, or so kind of transcend, or maybe try to reach a solution or end suffering maybe. Okay, what was that you had said? Peaceful?
And meaning.
Okay, so peaceful and meaningful. Okay, so that means he, you say that everything for him he felt was temporary. And therefore, okay, so in a way we can say that going beyond, okay, so attachments as obstacles. Okay, so inner peace gives satisfaction. Okay, spiritual enlightenment or spiritual fulfillment is more important. Okay, so now let's analyze this question a little bit more in detail. So first and foremost, what we are supposed to do is, from all that we have learned so far, try to get connecting Buddha's life and try to see what implications does it have on the Buddhist view. Because now slowly we have a transition towards the teachings of the Buddha. So we have seen his life, we have seen how he has gone through the different stages. Now we take a look at his teachings. So therefore this is a kind of a transition for us to connect and see how things are. So first and foremost, what we realize is, in the Buddhist view, more importance is given on the impermanence of material wealth. In fact, we see that for him everything was not permanent. And therefore his very own renunciation, it gives a testimony that riches cannot provide ultimate satisfaction. Then we also see that for Siddhartha, his decision to leave behind his princely life, it signifies that the importance of seeking higher goals. So we see that he gives up his princely life and goes in search of the answer for ending suffering. Next, as you all rightly said, inner peace. So Buddhism values inner peace, wisdom and enlightenment over external comfort and material abundance. So therefore inner peace is valued more than material abundance. And therefore his whole life exemplifies that true fulfillment comes from the inward journey, okay, from understanding the nature of one's existence. Another important thought from the Buddhist view is that of non-attachment. So from what we have learned, what does attachment lead to? Suffering. And therefore one of the ways to end the suffering is to be detached. And therefore he felt, or he demonstrated through his life, that this detachment helps to overcome suffering. Now we also see that he, through his life, okay, one of the most important things that we also learned was a balanced view, which then we see is translated in the middle path. Now when he began his journey towards enlightenment, what did he do? How did he begin the journey? Okay, so ascetic practices, okay, and this was extreme asceticism. On the other hand, when he was in the palace, how was his life? It was luxurious. Now we see that these two are both extremes, and neither of these led him to get satisfaction or fulfillment in life. Okay, neither in the palace, that's why he left and he went. Even when he was doing strict practices, fasting, etc., it had an adverse effect on his health, was not helpful. Therefore, he subscribes to the balanced approach or the middle path, which advocates for a life of moderation. Next, we also see that through his life, what is advocated is compassion and empathy. So therefore, by living his luxurious life and embracing this quest for ending suffering, he empathizes with all people whom he saw suffering, especially the first three. Okay, so therefore he empathizes with them, and in a way this signifies a commitment made by him to alleviate suffering. Similarly, yesterday we also saw how the bodhisattvas, okay, their whole life, okay, is in order to help other sentient beings. And finally, we see that the ultimate liberation that is nirvana. So therefore we see that his renunciation of princely life to seek enlightenment helps us to understand that in the Buddhist view, as we have already seen so far, material wealth is first and foremost not permanent, and it is not sufficient enough for somebody to have true spiritual fulfillment. Okay, so therefore all these other values like non-attachment, balanced view, compassion and empathy lead us to ultimate liberation. So by following his teachings, and which basically will include the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Okay, so let's move now towards the second question. Okay, how were the four signs important?
The temporalness of life.
Okay, so observation leading to realization. Any other opinions or views?
And the meaning. Even here suffering and impermanence of life.
Okay. Suffering plus impermanence.
To seek enlightenment, to get rid of attachments.
Okay, attachments, that would again
The path towards seeking enlightenment,
there will be always
suffering.
okay.
Because all these things, if a person in samadhi, there is so called suffering that you can. That's why all the suffering in the path.
And we can't even have control over it. So being aware will be going to be part of the life.
Okay, so good. Awareness and mindfulness. So, as you said rightly, the four signs, okay, that is old age, sickness, death, and the ascetic. Okay, at least the first three showed us various stages of life, in a way which all are subject to. So, for example, first and foremost, all these, the first three show about the impermanence, also it shows about the frailty of human body, and then when he sees the ascetic, it basically shows that there is a way to overcome, okay, obstacles or any challenges. There is a way to overcome these challenges, but one should find his or her own way. So for example, we see that when he saw the ascetic calm in the face of such disorder around him, he was wondering how is he so, and therefore he begins his journey based on that. So then we also see that all these indicate to us that suffering in a way is part and parcel, and therefore there is a need to understand the origin. And therefore there is no point in clinging to some fixed identities. So this would include all power, prestige, status, etc. There is no use of clinging to this because nothing is permanent. And therefore, when we look at its practical significance, what can we learn? First and foremost, we learn that we need to first and foremost reflect on life plus our existence, and this will in turn lead us to a deeper awareness of reality. So this also enables us to, in a way, cultivate detachment and therefore develop a disciplined, mindful life. Okay, so with this being done, let us now enter into the teachings of the Buddha, and first we'll take a look at the Four Noble Truths. Now these are basically in a way the foundation of Buddha's teachings, and in a way they present a framework to understand nature of suffering and the path to liberation. So we have already done this in the passing as we were looking at his life. Now we will look at it with more detail. So first and foremost, let us try to understand what are the Four Noble Truths. First is dukkha or suffering. Then you have the arising or the origin of dukkha. Then you have nirodha, that is the cessation of suffering. And finally you have the magga or the path that one can take in order to overcome this suffering. So let's take a look at the first noble truth, that is dukkha or suffering. So when we look at suffering, now this whole term dukkha, it goes beyond what is our understanding of suffering. Why? Because in a way it would include imperfection, impermanence, and also emptiness. Okay, so all this is in addition to already the common meanings that are there of pain, sorrow, and misery. So the term dukkha would comprise of all this: imperfection, impermanence, emptiness, pain, sorrow, and misery. Now at the same time, we see that there is so much of emphasis on dukkha or suffering. Might lead us to think that the Buddha did not consider happiness. Well, we see that the Buddha does not deny the existence of happiness. So he acknowledged both material and spiritual happiness, and we see that in the Buddhist texts also there are various kind of forms of happiness that are mentioned. Is it happening whole day or only now? It also is tired maybe. Switch off and okay. So as we said that the Buddha did not deny the existence of happiness. He acknowledged both material and spiritual happiness, and this basically can be seen in several Buddhist texts. Now, what are the various forms of happiness which is given? So you have happiness coming from family life, that from renunciation, happiness that also comes from attachment, physical plus mental pleasures. Now you may wonder, if everything is said about attachment, non-attachment, and also about, everything not being permanent, how can we speak about physical, mental pleasures, attachment, renunciation leading to happiness? Well, he acknowledged that yes, these can lead us to happiness, but he said that all these things are temporary. And ultimately, it will lead to suffering. And that is why we need to understand the three aspects of dukkha. Okay, so which are the three which we dealt with, which we just saw in the passing? No, so in a way we when in relation to the five aggregates, I had mentioned we'll take a look at it in detail. So what are the three aspects? One is ordinary suffering, okay, just suffering that we generally experience. Second is suffering which is produced by change, as a result of change. And then you have suffering as conditioned states. So let's take a look. So he says that these factors are important with regards to life as well as enjoyment of sense pleasures. So because he says that ultimately it is the desire which leads to suffering. And here we see that he speaks about the whole cycle. So you have desire. This desire then will lead you to look for the means of how to get. And then we see that once you have satisfied this, once you have got this means, there is some satisfaction which is temporary. Again you see that this leads to then emptiness, and ultimately you're back to the whole thing of desire because you want something more. If you look at our own lives, we see that this becomes quite prominent in many aspects. We want something, when we desire something, okay, whether it is physical or whether it is a gadget, etc., we try all our means, our whole attention is focused in getting that. Once we get that, there is satisfaction. After some time, it also loses its value because we are constantly using it, it becomes kind of monotonous. That leads to emptiness, and then again you want something else to fill the void. That is what we call as the cycle of desire, which ultimately leads to suffering. Okay, because it's an ongoing, one leads to another and it keeps on going around. So first and foremost, when we look at dukkha as ordinary suffering, here what would be included is birth, aging, illness, and in a way we see that this is part of human life. So also separation from people or things also causes this kind of, if you say, first level of suffering. So losing somebody, separation from certain things, or when you lose certain things, that in a way causes suffering. Now the next aspect, dukkha as produced by change, this in a way refers to suffering that comes from inevitable changes. Okay, so for example, let's take celebration. Okay, suppose you are planning a get together or a party. Initially there is a lot of excitement, okay, there is a lot of anticipation, and then when it is going on, you are happy because you are enjoying the moment, enjoying with your friends, enjoying with your loved ones, etc. What happens when it ends? Initially there is some satisfaction for that moment, but after that what happens? There is an emptiness. There is a kind of a void. Okay? Clear example would be for drinks. Okay? So you take one glass, you get little bit this thing, then you go for the second one, then third one, and what happens ultimately? For some this may be enough, others may go beyond, but what happens the next day? Okay, hangover, and then you realize, is the hangover worth the enjoyment of the previous day? Okay, because your whole next day you end up with a heavy head or some kind of fatigue, etc., dehydration, etc. So once again we see that though you enjoy it in the beginning, ultimately it leads to a kind of a void. Next, we see that also, for example, prosperity. So for example, you have a company, it's doing very well. Ultimately, you may have some unforeseen circumstances, and these unforeseen circumstances may ultimately cause you suffering, cause loss, it can cause distress as well as suffering. So this basically refers to dukkha as produced by change, which again will emphasize on the impermanence in life. And finally we see dukkha as conditioned states. Okay, and this here, which one?
Change, the second one, dukkha as produced by change.
Yes.
I'm not able to identify the difference between the first one and second one. What is the change?
Okay, so in a way we see that the first one is kind of part of human life, or something that happens is going to happen. This is when it comes as a result of certain unforeseen things. Okay, so you don't expect it, but it happens. Okay, so for example, a misfortune or an accident, so that produces some kind of an effect which you may have not intended. Okay, obviously.
Separation from people also may come to the change. Separation from people, things also, and intentional and accident.
Yes, it can come, but also we see that, see, once you are kind of experience certain things, you know that it will happen. Okay, but when it will happen, it will not know. Yes, separation can also come under that. So there is no hard and fast rule, it has to be as ordinary suffering. But here, when we look at separation, we just look at the basic what we experience. Okay, so it can come, but here this basically refers to something that happens all of a sudden, or inevitable. You cannot do anything in your control in order to deal with it. So dukkha as conditioned states would finally refer to the 5 aggregates. Now what are the 5 aggregates that we dealt with? What is the first one? Form. Next is feeling. Then you have perception, mental, mental formation, and then so for example, we see that all these 5 aggregates in a way can also lead to suffering, as we said. So last time we saw that how, for example, when somebody is attached to the form, okay, body changes over time, and being attached to that, attached to a physical form, can lead to suffering. Similarly, feeling pleasure from being in a positive state or from enjoying something can lead to happiness, which is again temporary. Whereas on the other hand, we see that touching some hot object or having some unpleasant feeling can lead to suffering. Okay, similarly, perception, as we spoke about recognition, then you had mental formation, which encompasses or which talks about thoughts, intentions, okay, etc. And finally we had consciousness. So at the beginning of next class, we'll begin with this, and then we move towards something that is called as the that there is no unmoving mover in Buddhism. Okay, so thank you, and tomorrow we'll begin with this and then go to the next.